The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. Wind tore through the blackwood pines, bending trees like brittle matchsticks. Inside the ranger station, the radio crackled ordinary check-ins, static. And then silence. Daniel Crow's voice broke through. His tone was steady at first, the way it always was when logging his patrols. But halfway through his report, something shifted. His words slowed, dragged with hesitation, as if he were watching something approach. "Base. You copy?" he whispered. A pause, then sharper. "There's someone out here." The dispatcher frowned, adjusting the dials. "Ranger Crow, confirm." "Did you say someone?" Static hissed. Then his voice again strained, shaking.
Ow.
"They're not supposed to be here." Watching me from the tree line. A crash echoed through the transmission, followed by heavy breathing. "If I don't," the signal warped, his final words nearly swallowed by static. "Don't let them," and then nothing. The line stayed open for 30 agonizing seconds. The only sound was the storm, distant thunder folding into silence. The dispatcher tried again. "Crow, do you copy?" "Daniel, respond?" No answer. Description lingered in the minds of those who heard it, the fear in his voice, so unlike the man they knew. Search teams scoured the forest for weeks, finding only tire tracks near an abandoned trailhead and the shredded remains of a park-issued jacket. No blood, no body, just absence. 2 years later, the town still speaks of that call. Children dare each other to imitate it. Adults lower their voices when it's mentioned.
For some,
it was only a ranger lost to the wilderness. For others, it was proof of something darker lurking in the pines. And then, one autumn afternoon, a hiker found his revolver. The revolver lay half-buried beneath a tangle of pine needles. Its steel eaten away by rust, the leather holster cracked, like brittle skin. For 2 years, the forest had kept its secret. Now, by chance, a lone hiker had stumbled upon the weapon that once belonged to Ranger Daniel Crow. The man who found it was shaken. "I thought it was junk at first," he told deputies later. "But then I saw the engraving Crow. That name, it chilled me." He hadn't touched it, only snapped a picture on his phone before running back down the trail. Heart hammering against his ribs. News traveled fast in Blackwood. By the next morning, the sheriff's department had roped off the site. Investigators sifted through the damp earth, photographing, cataloging, treating the discovery as if Daniel himself had been unearthed. For the town, it was more than evidence. It was a wound reopening. Daniel's wife Elena had fought to keep his memory alive, even as whispers of his affair and disappearance tarnished his name. To her, the revolver was both a confirmation and a curse, proof he hadn't simply abandoned her, but also a reminder that he was gone. At the ranger station, the old tape of Daniel's last call was replayed, its static-filled fear now paired with the grim reality of the weapon in the woods. Some whispered he must have dropped it while running. Others believed it was placed there, a warning left behind. "I knew he wasn't crazy," muttered Marissa Hale, one of his fellow rangers, under her breath during the briefing. "He said someone was out there. Maybe they still are." The forest, tall and unmoving, seemed to listen. Investigators mapped out Daniel's last patrol route once again, marking the revolver's location with a red flag. The trail stretched deeper, toward the heart of the pines where sunlight rarely touched the ground. For the first time in 2 years, there was momentum, steady, fragile, but enough to spark movement. The search was no longer about a missing ranger. It was about what else might be hidden beneath the soil, and in the days that followed, the focus would shift, not on the weapon, but on the man behind it. To the town of Blackwood, Daniel Crow had always been the model ranger. He was steady, soft-spoken, the kind of man who stayed late after shifts to file reports no one else wanted to touch. Neighbors remembered him waving from his truck, his uniform always crisp, his tone polite. But behind the badge, his life told a different story. Daniel's marriage to Alina had been faltering long before his disappearance. Friends described arguments that carried through the thin walls of their small home, whispers of jealousy, money troubles, and Daniel's increasing distance. He often buried himself in work, taking late patrols that kept him in the forest long after sunset. Why don't you just talk to me, Daniel? Alina once snapped, her voice sharp over the clatter of dishes. He had stared at the floor. Woods make more sense than we do lately. To some, it was dedication. To Alina, it was abandonment. Then came the rumors. Fellow Rangers recalled lingering glances between Daniel and Marissa Hale. A younger colleague with a quick laugh and an admiration that seemed to pull him out of his shell. Nothing was ever admitted, but the tension was unmistakable. At the station, whispers spread. Crow's distracted, one ranger muttered after a long patrol. He's carrying something heavy and it's not just the job. The revolver found in the pines only deepened the contradictions. Was Daniel a loyal husband? A devoted ranger lost to a predator in the woods? Or was he a man torn apart by secrets? His disappearance less about chance and more about choices? In the reopened investigation, detectives began to draw lines between his fractured marriage, his rumored affair, and his final terrified call. The man behind the badge was no longer a symbol of order. He was a puzzle of love, betrayal, and fear. And for Alina, those secrets were about to come crashing forward. Alina Crow sat in the small kitchen of her rented townhouse, staring at the Revolver's photograph in the morning paper. For 2 years she had lived in limbo, neither widow nor wife, her husband's absence defining every whispered conversation around town. Now, with the discovery of his weapon, eyes turned toward her. Again, she had once loved Daniel fiercely, but their marriage had eroded into bitterness. Nights stretched cold and wordless, punctuated only by fights that spiraled from nothing. He had withdrawn into the woods, leaving her to wonder if his heart belonged more to the forest or to someone else. "Do you even see me anymore?" had asked him once, her voice trembling. Daniel's answer was flat. "You're not the woman I married." The memory stung. Neighbors remembered Alina as loyal but sharp-tongued, her temper rising quickly when Daniel's name was mentioned. When investigators revisited her after the revolver's discovery, suspicion clung to her like shadow. Did resentment push her toward violence? Or was she simply another victim of a man with secrets? Elena's grief was complicated by humiliation. She knew the whispers about Marissa Hale, the ranger who lingered too long at Daniel's side. Betrayal had seeped into her marriage long before he vanished, leaving her with rage she could never quite bury. "People think I hated him," she told detectives during questioning. Her hands shook against the coffee cup. I hated what he did to us. I never wanted him gone." Her words were soft, but the room felt charged, as though truth and lies mingled together. The revolver had forced Daniel's memory back into the light. But for Alina, it also revived every wound. The community, hungry for answers, saw her as a woman scorned, someone who might have had motive. And as whispers grew louder, another voice emerged. The colleagues who claimed Daniel's paranoia wasn't imagined. Their testimonies would shift suspicion once again, away from Alina, and deeper into the forest. The ranger station smelled faintly of pine oil and damp paper, the kind of scent that clung to uniforms long after patrols. It was here, over weak coffee and the weight of old memories, that Daniel's colleagues began to speak. Some described him as steady but distant in those final weeks. His reports clipped, his eyes scanning the tree line, even when there was nothing there. Others claimed he confided fierce, quiet admissions that someone was out there. Watching, Daniel said he saw headlights on trails no one should have been driving, recalled Ranger Marcus Hale, leaning back in his chair. Said he'd find footprints where no hikers had signed in. I told him he was tired, working too many shifts, but he swore it. Another ranger, a younger recruit, offered a different perspective. It was wound tight, jumpy. Sometimes he'd spin around at the sound of branches cracking. Maybe he was seeing shadows that weren't there. The contradictions spread like wildfire. To some, Daniel had been paranoid, unraveling under the pressure of his crumbling marriage. To others, he had stumbled onto something he was never meant to see, before he disappeared. Marissa Hale added quietly, he told me, "If something happens, I don't believe it was an accident." Her eyes shifted away as though speaking. The words out loud gave them too much weight. The testimony unsettled investigators. The revolver in the forest hinted at danger. But the stories painted two very different portraits. A man losing his grip, or a man hunted at night. The station grew quieter, though conversations never strayed far from Daniel. Rumors turned the woods into something larger than life, a place where shadows carried intent, where silence felt heavy with presence. A dispatcher who had replayed Daniel's final call countless times summed up the unease. Whatever he saw that night, he believed it was real. You can hear it in his voice. That's not paranoia, that's terror. The whispers left more questions than answers. If Daniel wasn't imagining things, then someone or something had been stalking the pines. And soon, investigators would find proof that the forest itself held secrets darker than any rumor. The forest seemed endless as investigators pushed deeper into Daniel Crow's final patrol route. Rain slicked the undergrowth, and the pines closed in like walls. Then one deputy spotted a faint trail, nearly swallowed by moss and time. The path wasn't on any map. Following it led them to a cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were boarded, roof sagging under years of storms, but the lock on the door was new. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with mildew and something metallic. Flashlights swept across the walls. Photographs covered them, black and white prints. Grainy shots of hikers, rangers, families posing at trailheads. Some were marked with circles, others crossed out in red ink. "Jesus," one officer muttered. "This isn't random." On a wooden table lay a notebook, its pages filled with erratic scrawl. Dates, initials, cryptic phrases like "she watched too long and the forest remembers." But the most chilling find was a map tacked to the wall. Trails crisscrossed in blue ink, with red X's dotting secluded areas. Each X corresponded to an unsolved disappearance stretching back over a decade. Marissa Hale, who had insisted on accompanying the team, froze when she saw it. Daniel, he knew about this. That's why he sounded so afraid. The cabin felt less like a hideout and more like a shrine, a place where someone had cataloged the lives, swallowed by the woods. As evidence was bagged and tagged, investigators realized Daniel's final call hadn't been the rambling of a paranoid man. He had stumbled into something real, something calculated, and while the cabin gave them answers, it also raised the most dangerous question of all. Who had built it tanned? Were they still out there? Marissa Hale sat stiffly in the interview room, her ranger uniform neatly pressed, though her hands betrayed her, fingers twisting, restless, betraying nerves. For weeks, she had avoided reporters and colleagues, but the discovery of the cabin left her no room to hide. She began slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel and I. We weren't just co-workers, we were involved." The admission confirmed what many had suspected but never proven. She spoke of late-night patrols that turned into long conversations, stolen moments in the shadows of the forest. To her, Daniel was a man carrying burdens too heavy for his marriage, and she offered him an escape. But even that refuge, she admitted, had started to crumble. "He grew distant," she said, staring at the table. "I thought it was guilt, maybe regret. But then he told me he'd found something out here, something he shouldn't have." Her words darkened the room. "What do you mean by that?" an investigator pressed. Marissa hesitated, said someone was threatening him, that if he didn't stay quiet, he'd regret it. At first I thought he was being dramatic. He showed me a no signature, just 3 words, "Stop digging. Crow." The details added weight to Daniel's final radio call, twisting the narrative away from paranoia. Marissa admitted she had urged him to take a break, to go to the sheriff, but Daniel insisted he needed proof first. "He told me," her voice broke, "that if anything happened, I should tell the truth. And I didn't. I stayed silent." The silence in the room was suffocating. Her confession reframed Daniel's disappearance not as an accident, but as the consequence of secrets far larger than an affair. The threats, the hidden cabin, the map of disappearances age. Peace pointed toward a predator who knew the forest as well as the rangers themselves. As Marissa's voice faded, investigators exchanged grim looks. Her testimony was no longer about a failed romance. It was about a dangerous knowledge Daniel carried to his grave. And the next step would require them to return to the very last place. His voice had been heard. The static-filled tape of his final call. The tape had been replayed hundreds of times in the 2 years since Daniel Crow's disappearance, but never with the scrutiny it received now. In a dimly lit conference room at the sheriff's office, investigators huddled around old radio equipment. The grainy recording hissing through the speakers like a wound reopening. Daniel's voice filled the room, steady at first, then breaking. "Base, you copy? There's someone out here." The familiar static followed, but this time the sound was run through advanced filters. Frequencies were separated, cleaned, enhanced. For long minutes, it was nothing but crackles and distorted. When the technician froze, leaning closer. "Wait, play that section back." The tape rewound. Beneath Daniel's ragged breathing, just before the final distortion, another voice emerged. Low, deliberate, chilling. Only 3 words, whispered like a warning. "Don't look back." The room fell silent. That wasn't Crow, the sheriff said firmly. Marissa, sitting in the corner with her arms crossed tightly around herself, whispered, "He told me he heard someone." That's proof, but the discovery split the team. Some argued it was an audio artifact, a trick of interference. Others were certain it was human, a presence with Daniel in those final moments. "Boost it again," one detective insisted. The voice replayed, clearer this time, and its calmness made the hair on the back of their necks rise. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't rushed. It was controlled. For Alina, who had been invited to hear the tape as part of transparency, it was unbearable. She pressed her hands over her ears, whispering, "That's the last thing he heard." The revelation forced the investigation into darker territory. If someone else had been with Daniel that night, then his disappearance was not a mystery of wilderness, it was an act of intent. And with the cabin, photographs, and now the voice, the question was no longer if there was a predator in the forest, but how many victims were already buried beneath its soil. The search teams prepared once again. It's time not for a ranger, but for graves. The search began at dawn. When mist still clung to the treetops and the forest floor lay heavy with dew, dozens of officers, cadaver dogs, forensic teams spread out along Daniel Crow's final patrol route. Each step weighted with the knowledge of what they might uncover. Maps recovered from the hidden cabin were their guide cryptic red X's that marked areas deep within the pines. The Revolver's discovery site was the first anchor point, but it was what lay beyond it that mattered most. By mid-morning, the dogs alerted near a ravine. Officers dug carefully, shovels scraping against damp soil until they struck something. Unnatural, cloth, jacket, torn and rotted, still clung to human remains. One deputy removed his hat, eyes lowered. "That's not Crow." The realization was worse. It meant someone else. As hours turned to days, the search expanded. More shallow graves surfaced, each one yielding fragments of lives cut short. A silver locket engraved with initials, a cracked pair of glasses, a faded backpack decorated with patches. Items investigators matched to missing persons cases that had haunted the county for years. "This isn't random," the sheriff muttered grimly as evidence bags filled. "It's a hunting ground." The discovery chilled even the most seasoned officers. The forest that had once symbolized Blackwood's beauty was now a graveyard. At night, campfires flickered at the command post, while weary investigators whispered about the voice on the tape. If Daniel had uncovered these graves, it explained the terror in his final call. It also explained why he had been silenced. Alina stood at the perimeter one evening clutching Daniel's photo. He tried to stop this. She whispered to no one in particular. He died because of it. Search brought answers, but also dread. For every grave uncovered, there were likely more red X's still unvisited on the map. And when investigators traced one of those marks to a ranger access road, suspicion turned inward. Whoever had hunted these woods had knowledge only an insider would possess. The discovery of multiple graves shifted the investigation from tragedy to conspiracy. Whoever had stalked the forest knew the terrain with intimate precision where patrols crossed. Where hikers wandered, where silence was most absolute, it wasn't random, it was someone who belonged. At first, suspicion swung back toward Alina. Her bitterness toward Daniel was no secret, and interrogators pressed her hard. She sat rigid, eyes narrowed, her voice sharp with exhaustion. "You think I buried strangers in the woods?" I wanted answers, not bodies. Her anger rang true, but her alibi held. She had been in town the night Daniel vanished. Marissa Hale was. Next, the affair had already painted her in shadow, but under questioning she broke down, trembling. I loved him, but I didn't kill him. He told me someone was following him, one of our own. I thought he was paranoid. God help me, I didn't believe him. Her tears carried the weight of guilt, but not evidence. What she offered instead was more dangerous. Daniel's suspicion that a ranger someone trusted was involved. Investigators turned inward. Patrol logs were reviewed, gate access examined. Then there it was. Ranger truck logged near the hidden cabin weeks before Daniel's disappearance. The driver, Marcus Hale, Marissa's brother, and Daniel's longtime colleague. Confronted, Marcus grew defensive. You think I had something to do with this? Those logs don't mean a damn thing. They cover miles of forest. Maybe my route crossed near that cabin. Doesn't prove I built it. But his denial couldn't mask the tension in the room. Other rangers recalled Daniel confiding his fear of Marcus specifically, though none had spoken of it before. I said Hale was watching him, one admitted reluctantly. We thought it was just rivalry. The betrayal stung deeper because Marcus had been part of the search team, digging through the graves, standing shoulder to shoulder with investigators, as though he, too, sought justice. The revelation cracked open the tight-knit ranger community. If one of their own had used the forest as a hunting ground, then loyalty had blinded them all. And as Marcus sat in silence, refusing further answers, investigators realized the case had shifted once again. Daniel Crow had not just been silenced by a stranger in the woods, he had been betrayed by someone he trusted. But whether Marcus was the predator or only part of something larger remained uncertain. The interrogation room had fallen silent. Marcus Hale's refusal to speak only deepened the shadows already cast over the case. But investigators weren't finished. They turned back to the evidence, the revolver Daniel had carried on his last patrol. It had been logged, examined, and nearly forgotten. Now, with fresh urgency, forensic analysts revisited it. Etched into the metal, faint but deliberate, were scratches. Not accidental wear, but letters, words. Daniel's last message. One examiner leaned closer, reading under the glare of sterile light. Elle was no confession written in ink, but a desperate engraving made by a man who understood. His time was running out. Narration filled the void in the investigators' minds. Daniel knew who hunted him. He knew the forest wasn't haunted by shadows, but by a man he had once called brother. The revolver became testimony from beyond the grave. When confronted again, Marcus's mask slipped. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor. Oh, I think you've got the whole picture. You don't? You have no idea what he walked into. What did he walk into? An agent pressed, but Marcus only shook his head. I'm not the only one. Those 4 words unraveled the case further. If true, the graves scattered across the forest weren't the work of a single predator, but the result of a conspiracy others within the Park Service, perhaps even beyond. Still, Daniel's fate became clear. Had pieced together what one else dared, and in doing so, signed his own death warrant. Marissa Hale sat pale and hollow as news spread. He tried to warn me, she whispered. I told him to let it go, that it wasn't worth his life. Said if I don't follow the trail, no one will. Her words painted Daniel not as a reckless ranger, but as a man burdened with truth too heavy to ignore. The town received the revelations with a mix of grief and fury. Candlelight vigils lit up the park gates, mourners standing beneath trees that now seemed menacing, complicit in silence. Parents held their children tighter. For years, whispers of missing hikers had been dismissed as accidents. Now, those whispers rang like screams they had refused to hear. Yet even with Marcus in custody, justice felt unfinished. Rumors swirled that files had gone missing, that certain supervisors pushed to close the case quickly, that deeper secrets still hid within. The ranger service at Daniel's memorial Alina stood apart, a figure both pitied and scrutinized. She had loved him once, hated him later, but now was left with the complicated grief of someone who had known every side of the man. She laid a hand on the folded flag and muttered, "They'll never tell the whole truth, Daniel. But you left. Enough for them to find." The documentary-style narration cut in once more. What remains are fragments, a revolver with a name carved into steel, shallow graves scattered across a wilderness meant for wonder, and a community left to reconcile. The cost of silence. Daniel Crowe is remembered not for how he lived, but for how he died, chasing shadows until they consumed him. In the end, the forest still stood, vast and indifferent. The trails remained open, though few walked them without unease. Signs warning of hazardous conditions now carried a darker meaning for those who knew, and so the question lingered, spoken quietly at town halls, over kitchen tables. In the uneasy silence before sleep, was justice done, or had it arrived too late, till it after the soil had already swallowed too much truth? For Daniel, there would be no answer. Only the revolver, scarred with his last testimony, remained to speak for him.